where's hockey? Where's youth hockey going? Well, let's go from where it started. Like, if you go, I know this is old school, but like we go Bobby Orr, Bobby Orr and Gordie Howe and all that stuff. But it's relative. Okay,
Totally.
it was innocence almost. It was like people played hockey because they loved hockey.
Okay.
That's how hockey was back then. You can make more money working at the Inco mine in Sudbury or at the paper mill in Pembroke
Yeah.
than you could, or the steel mills in Hamilton and
Yeah.
Sioux, than you could playing hockey. But what happened is people played the game because they loved playing hockey. So you had the Gordie Howes, all these guys playing in their outdoor rinks, rivers,
Yeah.
shitty equipment, and
Rocket
they just
Richard.
they just played the game. That's
Yeah.
Rocket Richard. They just played the game and they loved it. Now, of course, things evolve. So, but my point of that is like the innocence was they just played hockey because they loved the game. Parents didn't really necessarily go and watch. You'd walk to games or whatever because it wasn't important. Like people had food to put on the table, and
It's a hobby.
kids played, and some guys were good and moved on. Okay, so things moved on. But how people were discovered back then is like you'd play for a local team or whatever. Maybe you'd have an all-star team once in a while, and you go play one small town for another small town, and you'd have a great game of hockey, right? And it built on that. So then, let's say the 70s. The 70s, we're almost at the 70s, 100 years later. So when I was a kid in the 70s, how hockey was for me, like, so I grew up in Sudbury, Ontario, Northern Ontario. It's not Toronto. Like, and I'm going to exclude Toronto a little bit but even then, we played against teams like Chinguacousy. What's Chinguacousy? What's Wexford? Right? Those were actually AAA teams at the time.
Yeah.
Right? Because they're no more. So, anyways, we would play, like I played when I was very young, and we played in a town called Coppercliff because I wasn't old enough to play in Coppercliff's where the Big Nickel is.
Mhm.
So I wasn't old enough to play in the City League, which would be the City plus AAA. Yeah. So I played in Coppercliff, and then we had an all-star team, and we'd go to play teams like Sioux, North Bay, little things. We have these all-star tournaments, and you go play for your regular team during the season. And I really enjoyed that. I liked that because it was like playing with your friends, and then you got, the better players got to go play in a tournament a few times a year. It was great. So then as I got older, obviously Adam Peewee, there was the AAA loop. Then the AAA loop was good, but like say Sudbury itself, like my hometown, we weren't allowed to take the kids outside of the city of Sudbury. So like the county boys, like places like Lively, Garson, these are little towns, guys. Valley East, Ontario Falls, and all that stuff. They weren't allowed to come and play with us because of the boundaries. So that was like, we would have had a pretty good team if we were allowed to do that. We weren't allowed to do that. So these guys had to play double A or A or whatever it is, and we got to play triple A. We got to go to the big tournaments and stuff like that. But guess what? Those guys still got drafted. They still got to play junior somewhere, and they still got drafted, and it was really good. And then as it moved on, obviously AAA became a big thing. Now I remember going back. So let's say back when Zach Cassian and Danny Maggio and Ryan Wilson and all those guys were playing youth hockey.
Yeah, in early 2000s.
Early 2000s. I remember having camps, and the AAA kids where they were really good. But what was also really good is you could take on every local AA team here, or A, whatever you want to call it. You could take 4 or 5 guys off of every single one of those teams, and they had the margin of difference in the quality of player between like the bottom half of a AAA player and the top half of a AA player was very, very small, very interchangeable. And the AA loop was like really good hockey. It was actually very good.
I remember it was the same when I played.
Yeah,
when I was playing, it was the same because I was just a couple years after them. Same thing. We had 3-4 guys on the AA teams. When we started to get older towards draft year, that would jumped up, and we were kind of like waiting for them to come to make our team better because they were good players, right?
Yeah, and then it kind of changed again to like I would say maybe 6-7 years ago. Let's say 10 years ago. I found that the gap between like on most AAA teams was that you'd have 2 lines that were pretty good or really good, and then the third line would be like, on not every team, but for the most part, the third line would be like, there's a difference now.
Yeah. And
then to find another person or two to replace any of those guys, it became very, very difficult to do. And I found that the AA loop became very, very weak. Now, why did that happen?
That's what I was just going to ask you.
Why did that happen? So I think what happens is there's been so much marketing in hockey, right? Like in Canada anyway. So the American kids, you actually have a pretty neat system because they in all college sports they kind of or all sports they kind of have that local high school college like that's the goal. So you kind of stay on the in the same. You're kind of on the same path. It's kind of so. But anyways, so what I think happened here was with all the marketing and all the big year being an OHL or CHL draft year, so many people were putting their eyes on what happens at 16. And they were seeing guys at 14, 15, and then they're not getting drafted. And it was like they just quit because, going back to the Hockey Canada thing, they have all these rules implemented in who can go up and play Junior B, who can play Junior C, and they limit it to one or two. I understand to a certain extent why they implement these things because if I mean, you could stack 16-year-olds, and you could take away from this midget and all that kind of stuff, and you could water it down either way. But what happens is they made the decision that even though we might have 4 guys or 5 guys that are 16 years old that are really really good, and only 1 or 2 of you are allowed to go play Junior B and move up, and it's like why? So, anyways, my point to this is, I found that what happened is 14, 15, 16 kids were so much pressure and so much talk about being good at 16 that if they weren't 14, 15, 16 years old and they weren't like top dogs, it was almost like they didn't want to pursue it anymore. It's like quitting. The parents were like, "Well, you're no good. Like, you should do other things." And they never kept the kids in focus.
Yeah.
So I think one of the biggest things that happened here in Ontario, Canada, maybe Ontario anyways, is like, so in the 80s and probably before that when I played, there was the 17-year-old draft. That's what it was. And then they made exceptions for 3 rounds, or then they moved it to 5 rounds where you could be an underage, a 16-year-old. And I think what that did is that so if you didn't get drafted at 16, it wasn't a big deal. You played till 17. You got drafted out of major midget, most guys. And so that kept a kid in focus a little bit longer. That 1 year makes a huge difference in hockey.
Oh,
you
dude.
see guys, man, that were really good in minor midget that you think are going to get drafted, and the next year it's like that next kid is the kid that was maybe not as much of a big star, grew all those things, and he's actually as good or better.
Dude, that was me. I was exactly
for sure.
That.
It was you.
If I had one more year playing AAA, and to be fair, there like a lot of the good players are gone when you play midget major here now and all that kind of stuff. But I was a significantly better player a year later after my draft year. And it was like if that would have happened 6 months sooner, and this is like a whole other thing where it was like late birthday guy, grow a little bit later, that 1 extra year of letting all the boys go through puberty, because that's prime time, man. Like 14, 15, 16, 17 is prime time. And we even see it with the guys here that play junior that are like some of these kids are units now. And it was like 2 years ago where they were like little boys, So it's like that extra breathing room that they get. But I think that's a really good point, is everyone puts so much stock on that 16-year-old time frame, and you see the kids disappear because it's like, well, I'm not good enough anyway, so whatever.
Well, so you got I can't even, well, how many people walk in here when their kid is a good hockey player at 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, and they talk like, and the parents just talk, and they need, they're the best thing since sliced bread and all that kind of stuff. And then when it doesn't happen, it's almost like the parents say, okay, I'm putting words in their mouth, but it's like, okay, now you're not living up to what I was talking about. It's either make excuses or find something else to do or whatever. But anyways, I find that a lot of people, when they get to 15 years old, the seriousness or the dedication to being a good hockey player kind of goes away.
Yep.
And it's only the ones that are good at the time. But that's not only. There's still a lot of guys that still love to play the game, right? And they still keep pursuing it. But for the most part, you see guys go different directions. Now, is it because there's all kinds of different things that kids can get interested now? Like, I mean, you play video games and all that kind of stuff. Like back years ago, that stuff wasn't there. You just went and played sports.
Yeah, but sorry to cut you off.
No,
it's just it is the unnecessary heartbreak of not being drafted, where you see guys they all fall off now. And it happens every single year here, from midget minor to midget major. It's like midget minor, I got every single kid here is working out, training, consistent, on the ice, working hard, doing all the things that they think they're supposed to be doing. Draft comes and goes. Midget major comes now. The kids that got drafted are gone or playing junior, and the other 13 kids that were on that team, I might have 3 that are still here the next year, continuing to work. Maybe.
No, I know.
And
I know
that
it drops
happens.
off big time.
That turnover is
Yeah.
insane. Where it's like
Yeah.
all of a sudden these kids just think, yeah, well,
And
that's
it's crazy because you're not done being a hockey player at 16. Some
100%.
guys might be done. They might
Yeah.
have peaked.
Yeah. Yeah.
And some guys might be done because they're not good enough. But guys that work hard and dedicate themselves, and I mean, you're 16.
There's a lot
You
more
get
hockey
4
to
or
play,
5,
man.
6
Yeah.
years to get something to happen. Not saying that everyone's going to get something. That's not the truth. But it's that.